We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other publications whose directors have attended our meetings and restricted their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government.
That these men aim to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. In short, they seek total and quiet control.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to SF Commons. We are delighted and we're very fortunate to have Mr. Peter Merrick, a cross-border expert, in our show tonight. We are going to talk about the one world government. So, Peter, what is the one world government?
The one world government happens to be to control everything that we do. And what's happening is it's been around for a long time. We're just starting to see it because it's at the final stages.
Get ready for wars in the name of the free, vaccinations for illness that will never be, the assault on your children's impressionable minds, and a microchipped world. You'll put up no fight. Information suppression will keep you in tone. Depopulation of peasants was always our goal. But eugenics was not what we hoped it would be. Oh yes, it was us that funded Nazis. But as long as we own all the media too, what's really happening does not concern you. So just go on watching your plasma TV, and the world will be run by the ones you can't see.
And they have to come out and they have to tell us now, because we're starting to notice things don't make sense.
The United Nations can and should play an essential role in helping the world find a satisfactory way of stabilizing world population and stimulating economic development in a manner that is sensitive to religious and moral considerations. Economic growth is, of course, an inevitable corollary of a growing population and is essential to improved standards of living. But without careful coordination, unrestrained economic growth poses further threats to our environment.
President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
There's a need for a new world order.
Novus order seclorum, a new order for the centuries, for the ages, forever.
I think a new world order is emerging.
Out of it came a new Europe, a new world order.
The affirmative task we have now is to actually create a new world order.
The mistake in creating the kind of world order that I think all of us would like to see.
You really need to bring China into the creation of a new world order.
You don't speak out now, and this one world government, this control system goes into place, you won't have the ability to speak. So all the freedoms, the freedom to keep quiet, well, that's a freedom right now. And the freedom to speak, that is a freedom right now. And you will lose it if you don't use it. So I want to share with you my wake-up moment. You started hearing about people dying on the streets in China and what was happening in Italy. And we were scared. And this was going to be the virus that was going to kill 100, 200 million people, where we're told that what the Spanish flu did. It killed more people during the Spanish flu, we're told, than World War I. So I came back to Toronto, and everything was locked down. And I would go for long walks. And I was hearing chatter that the hospitals were empty. So I would walk past the largest hospitals in Canada, and I would see the ambulance drivers outside smoking cigarettes, empty. I would walk by 4 hospitals every single day. And then I would turn on the news, and they were talking about how the hospitals were full, and how it was like we were all going to die. And it was a wake up for me, because I was actually on the ground walking past the 4 largest hospitals in downtown Toronto. They were like clustered. Those who chose not to be vaxxed had an onslaught of attacks like we've never seen before since Nazi Germany. I know that's very strong, but I live in Canada, and if you chose not to get vaxxed, they knew that you weren't vaxxed because they have a centralized medical system where everything's computerized. So they knew who had a QR code, who didn't. You weren't allowed into restaurants. You weren't allowed to go shopping. So those people who chose not to participate, they showed that they had character.
What organizations are behind this one world government?
During this time, I spent a lot of time reading first source documents, going to the Rockefellers Institute, going to the World Health Organization, going to the UN, and reading their white papers. And if you read them, they tell you what they want done. I went and I read the first works from the Club of Rome, which was the organization that was created in 1969, which brought up the environment, and they had a computer model that says we're all gonna die. And if we don't make our changes, and they weren't talking about carbon back then, but they were saying that they were talking about we're going to overpopulate.
The planet can support something like 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion, depending on how much liberty and how much material consumption you want to have. If you want more liberty and more consumption, you have to have fewer people. And conversely, you can have more people. I mean, we could even have 8 or 9 billion probably if we have a very strong dictatorship, which is smart. That's, unfortunately, you never have smart dictatorships. They're always stupid. So, but if you had a smart dictatorship and a low standard of living, you can have it. But we want to have freedom, and we want to have a high sentence, so we're going to have 1 billion people. And we're now at 7, so we have to get back down. I hope that this can be slow, relatively slow, and that it can be done in a way which is relatively equal.
However, the result of these positive measures is a world population that has risen during the same short period of time geometrically to almost 6 billion people, and could easily exceed 8 billion by the year 2020. The negative impact of population growth on all of our planetary ecosystems is becoming appallingly evident.
So we may be facing, in the 21st century, a completely new kind of inequality, which we have never seen before in human history. On the one hand, the emergence of a new upgraded elite of superhumans, enhanced by bioengineering and brain-computer interfaces and things like that. And on the other hand, a new, massive, useless class. A class that has no military or economic usefulness, and therefore also no political power.
Now, the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
You find out that, yes, the Rockefellers were part of it. But the question I ask myself, and the question is, if I was the devil, what would I do? And then what I would do is I would appoint a Bond villain to be the head of the World Economic Forum, because look at that guy.
History is truly at a turning point. Global energy systems, food systems, and supply chains will be deeply affected. In times of crisis, the role of governments is more important and more relevant than ever. The profound challenges to mankind, such as climate change, are globally interconnected and require collaborative responses.
He's a caricature. No one's going to like him. He's a caricature of a Bonneville. You know, when he speaks, and people just sit there and we weren't paying attention. But who controls him? I heard a really great term that I didn't know before. It's called a dog king. Dog king comes from around the 600s, where the Swedes defeated the Danes. And what the Swedish king did to humiliate the Danes is he appointed a dog to be their king, to humiliate the people, the Danish people. So think about all the leaders now. We are being humiliated. We're having dog kings appointed everywhere. Ardern down in New Zealand. We've got Macron in France. We had Johnson with Trudeau in Canada. You have Biden in the United States. And it's to humiliate the people because we know that these people are fools. But who's the bigger fool? If I listen to a fool, that makes me the bigger fool. That makes me an idiot. And how is that not humiliating?
Now we see the creation of a new massive class of useless people. As computers become better and better in more and more fields, there is a distinct possibility that computers will outperform us in most tasks and will make humans redundant. And then the big political and economic question of the 21st century will be, what do we need humans for? Or at least, what do we need so many humans for?
Klaus Schwab is threatening the head of government of the 20 most industrialized nations in the world to carry out the programmatic points of the Great Reset in their nation.
And what we discovered with this one world government, which basically is a bunch of non-elected individuals who get together at the same parties, at the same meetings, and they talk about the chattel. They talk about the useless eaters as they eat steak and as they fly into Davos.
Big effort to, some would say, to build back better. We would say to really have a great reset.
The terrible damage of COVID as we try to build back from this global pandemic.
Building back better.
To do things differently. To build back better.
And build it back better.
My plan to build back better.
Start taking all the problems that have been created in education and mental health and start to build back in a positive way.
Our information is being censored and controlled, and you want to control people's information, so I applaud you for doing this program. Because if you can control the information you receive, you can control a person's perception of reality. And by controlling their perception of reality, you'll control their behavior.
The media is controlled.
One of the things that we all have to be aware of, there's something called capture. 80% of the Fortune 5,000 companies are controlled by BlackRock.
You now make a point of, that's an investment criteria for you.
Well, behaviors are going to have to change, and this is one thing we're asking companies. You have to force behaviors. And at BlackRock, we are forcing behaviors. 54% of the incoming class are women. We added 4 more points in terms of diverse employment this year. And what we're doing internally is, if you don't achieve these levels of impact, your compensation could be impacted.
That Citibank, Berkshire Hathaway, Fidelity, and BlackRock and Vanguard control pretty well everything. And then when you start digging further, you find out, well, BlackRock owns most of the companies out there. They've got their Aladdin software that basically trades and advises about $21 trillion the last time I looked, not direct control, They're about $10 trillion right now. But then, when you really dig, you've got Vanguard. Nobody knows who owns Vanguard because it's a bunch of private corporations like BlackRock saying we need to have socially responsible. We need to change the natures of the boardroom. Why would Bud Light do something that was mortally injuring to it? Because they were told they wouldn't get money. So they would take a big loss because if all the loans were stopped because we live on credit, because we live in a fiat system, that they'll be put out of business, not because they won't have customers, because they won't have money to buy supplies, to operate, and they'll go bankrupt. Crony capitalism is where the government puts such strict regulations that you can only shop at certain places, and monopolies are formed because certain organizations, people who can be co-opted, they'll have an endless stream of money.
Why do you think Western governments are so hot for digital currency?
The magic word, Mark. It's all about control. Because as much as this man says, of course, that it's just digital money, it's not just digital money. And that's what people have to understand. When politicians or Klaus Schwab or anybody who is a globalist and wants globalist policies speaks about digital currencies, what they mean is a financial monetary system that is governed on a global level, or at first governed by, indeed, your bank. So it's not really money. The more accurate term I would say for this is that you get credit from your bank that is potentially what they call programmable. So that means that you don't actually possess your money. You are basically a serf to a neo-feudalist system, in this case the bank or the government, that decides for you what you can spend your money on. That is what's important here. CBDCs are in essence programmable. So the government could potentially decide what you can spend your money on and what you could not spend it on. And we all know, of course, what that type of world will look like.
I remember when the dot-com started. Amazon started off as a bookseller. It never made money, but for some reason it kept on going to the market and it kept on getting money. And it wasn't getting money from the average Joe or Jane. It was coming from these large organizations who ran huge money, fiat money. And regulations were put in. We saw it firsthand. You couldn't go to a church, but you could go to a Walmart or to a Costco. And small businesses were deemed not necessary. Who deemed it? Government. And that's a form of crony capitalism, not just the fact that I'm giving a contract to a business, changing regulations that larger corporations or certain groups will get favorable status in their lending, or putting restrictions that certain businesses can open and other businesses, small businesses, won't open.
We don't have a free market, don't kid yourself. The business people are just the opposite. They're all in favor of freedom for everybody else. And at the drop of a hat, you can get any leading businessman to give you an eloquent speech on the virtues of free market. But when it comes to their own business, they want to go down to Washington and get a special tariff to protect their business. They want a special tax deduction. They want a tax subsidy. But in the main, most businessmen are enemies of free markets.
A society has a benefit when you have a strong middle class, because these are people who are not married to the state. A society is stronger when you have strong families. It is weaker when you have broken families, but the state is stronger because people become married to the state. They look to the state instead of looking for real people. They look for this nebulous body, which they call government. I've met people in government. Most of them are incompetent. So they're incompetent individually, but I'm supposed to believe they're omnipowerful and they care about people. But all I have to do is walk over to a government building and I can see that the best people are not working for the government. are the most innovative, are the most entrepreneurial, are the most independent, but we're supposed to turn to the government. So crony capitalism comes in many forms. The GDP is the amount of money transacting within the economy. And you know what that includes? Crime, prisons, divorce. Is there a nuclear plant near you? There's a meltdown in a nuclear plant near me, and tons of people started dying. Guess what happens? Because of the flowers and the funerals and everything, guess what? The GDP goes up. In Alaska, when there was a big leakage in a oil tanker and it polluted, it killed nature. What happened was the Alaskan economy had $5 billion infused in it. Now, do you think that increased the quality of life? It happens to be paper money. It's the fractional banking system. There's a problem. Problem is that the government, through the Federal Reserve, gives licenses for institutions to create money out of nothing. So let me give an example. I happen to have a deficit of $1 trillion. So I go to the Federal Reserve and I give them a bunch of paper and they exchange it for paper, but their paper has interest. Now, the US government has this fiat cash of $1 trillion. It has to go somewhere. You put it in a bank. The banks have restrictions on how much they have to keep in reserves, and it's gone down to zero. So what they do is if they have that $1 trillion sitting in a bank, they can lend all of it. And let's say they charge 5% interest on it. This is something that didn't exist. It's just been added. They're able to lend all of it. That money, by the time it's finished being lent, that started off with the government, it's probably $100 trillion. At $1 trillion. It's been magnified. Your money, when you buy your home and you go to the bank and you borrow, let's say, $500,000 for a mortgage, that money didn't exist until you borrowed it. And if you falter, they'll take a real asset from you for something that didn't exist. And people don't know that. And that's why people in the money business make a ton of money, because they're making money off of something that didn't exist and they figured it out. It doesn't exist. What is the greatest? The greatest control is fear. The big fear people had is like, oh, there's going to be nuclear weapons going off, or there's going to be millions and billions of people are all going to die of this new virus. Fear.
They're destroying the middle class, and the Great Depression is being engineered.
And in the height of the Depression in 1930, the average income was about $4,800. That's equivalent to $89,000 today. The average house cost in the United States is $415. What does that translate to? That $4,800 is equivalent to $89,000, but the average American earns $54,000, so it hasn't kept up. The average house back in 1930, the worst depression that the United States has faced, it cost the equivalent of $79,000 today, but now it costs $450,000. The average car cost $15,000 in today's dollars, based if it was $800 back in 1930. The average car is $40,000. So they've been sold a big lie. And if you go and read Plato, he talks really simply. It's like him and Aristotle. Get the children when they're young, and you can control the population.
I think the American public should be able to have informed consent when deciding whether or not to take a experimental vaccine one way or the other.
Stephanie DeGarry says her 12-year-old daughter, Maddie, participated in the Pfizer COVID vaccine trial last year, but has not been the same since.
Over the past 5 months, Maddie has been to the ER 9 times and has been hospitalized 3 times for a total of 2 months. She was totally fine before this. She did the right thing trying to help everybody else, and they're not helping her.
In the end, these participants say they just want others to know what they went through.
That small minority that are suffering severe symptoms. We want to deny that reality.
No one is going to protect our future more than the nuclear family and a parent over their children. And I have to share with you, in California, there's some really wacky laws that are getting passed in Sacramento, and there's 40 million people living in California, and no one's paying attention to these wacky laws that are getting passed in California. But you know what the result is? You walk outside and you see feces. You see needles. You see people on the street. That's the result of what's happening in Sacramento, and no one's paying attention. All you need to do is understand your rights. Do not acquiesce to tyrants and to evil and to stupidity. And once you know, you need to educate. That is your responsibility to the people who came before you, to the children of today and the generations tomorrow. Why should you? Because your existence ends when there's no children. So we need to focus on our responsibility to the next generation. We are a product of those who sacrificed before us. And there's been great people in the past, and they've gone against things that were probably much worse. And they only have that power if we acquiesce. And then there happens to be the 20% that will not acquiesce. They see that something's wrong, and they will not acquiesce to the evil. And that's the group that has changed society. The beginning of the American Revolution, only 3% of the population in the colonies supported the revolution. I like to leave with this. You have the ability now to share your voice, to say, I will not acquiesce to stupidity. I will not acquiesce to evil. I will not acquiesce to peer pressure. I know it's right, and I know life is finite. Yes, I am scared of what will be, but I will not sell my soul, because that is the greatest currency that any of us have.